r/askreddit. Historians of Reddit. What is the biggest fuck you moment in history?
Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them. One of them with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send a very fast working one to Moscow, and I certainly won't have to send another. Tito to Joseph Stalin.
If someone made a black comedy TV series about the Eastern Bloc, this would be one of the highlights.
Have you seen The Death of Stalin?
The Battle of Alesia. Julius Caesar's attacking some Gauls in modern-day France, and they go hide in a castle on top of a hill. Caesar's army isn't big enough to take them all at once, and the Gauls have reinforcements coming, so a siege is impossible. So Caesar just builds a bigger castle around the one he's attacking. He literally just built 2 walls back to back in a ring around the castle. The first Gaul army was already too small to defeat Caesar, and his fortifications only gave him a greater advantage. The reinforcements were also unable to defeat Caesar's army now that he was behind several layers of spike pits and both earthen and wooden walls. Plus, the Gauls inside had no way to communicate with the reinforcements outside, so they couldn't coordinate attacks. Both Gallic armies were defeated as they attacked Caesar's newly built fortifications, and Caesar emerged victorious. It's probably my favorite battle of all time.
The construction and use of the werewolf, supposedly the largest trebuchet ever built. When it was disassembled, it would fill up 30 wagons. So anyways, King Edward I built this to siege a Scottish castle. But before it was even built, the Scottish people tried to surrender, to which Edward responded with a prompt no. In actuality, he responded with, "You do not deserve any grace, but must surrender to my will." In other words, I built this trebuchet over 40 days, and I am most definitely going to use it, and proceeded to use the trebuchet anyways.
The second defenestration of Prague. The Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia sends representatives to the Protestant city of Prague telling them to convert to Catholicism. The representatives get thrown out a window and allegedly landed in a pile of manure.
This was the first instance of a bounce check. No, edit. Gotta admit, man, not when I'm drinking.
So when France exiles Napoleon Bonaparte the first time, they didn't think to change out military personnel. So he basically rolls up to the first French outpost he gets to, says a soup, and begins reassembling an army. By the time he gets to Paris, he's got enough forces that France is like, well, welcome back. Guess who's back? Back again.
Ferruccio Lamborghini was a rich man owning his company that built tractors. He talked to Ferrari about the imperfections of his car and how to improve them, and they basically laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sport cars. So he decided to start making luxury sport cars. To compete with Ferrari, and thus the rivalry was born. So I'd say the middle finger of this guy to Ferrari was pretty noticeable.
A pirate known as Jean Lafitte had a bounty of $500 put on him by a governor. So he put a $5,000 bounty on the governor.
That's not even Jean Lafitte's best FU moment, in my opinion. He was propositioned by the British. Basically, hey, show us how to navigate the swamps around New Orleans so we can launch a sneak attack, and the king will pardon you and make you a privateer. And he was like, give me a fortnight to consider it. So he snuck over to the governor's mansion, scaled the outside wall, and was waiting for him on his office. Told the governor and Andrew Jackson the British plan and offer and how he wouldn't betray New Orleans because he loved her. So all he asked was for a pardon, and he'd give them everything they needed to win the war. And he did. Fuck the British, eh?
This is more petty, but when Taft bragged to his friends via telegram about scaling a mountain on horseback, that it was a few thousand feet, clear weather, all in all not too difficult, his friend replied, "How is horse?" Ah.
It makes me so very happy to know that ball. Busting between friends is an age-old tradition. Even better that it involved a president.
In the 1970s, the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia, asked for state funding to replace a bridge into town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding they needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town and you be asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War isn't a big middle finger to the state government, then I don't know what is.
The funny part is that 2 Soviet representatives at the US Embassy actually came over to look at the broken bridge and seriously considered funding the rebuilding to piss off the Americans.
Imagine the propaganda the Soviets could have pushed from that.
Napoleon invited his brother-in-law to speak with him before his coronation as emperor to remind the brother-in-law that he objected to Napoleon marrying Josephine because Napoleon would have power amount to nothing.
Now this is the kind of petty FU I can get behind.
This requires some background. The Spartans were famously blunt. They were trained to educate to the points when speaking, instead of using artsy and beautiful language that would have been common at the time, by being bitten on the thumb if they became long-winded. Now, to the meat, Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent the Spartans a letter saying, would you like me to enter your land as friend or foe? Spartans responded with one word. Neither. Philip was irate. He then sent another long-winded message. If once I enter into your territories, I will destroy ye all, never to rise again. The Spartans then sent back one word. I stuff. It was like putting your head in a lion's mouth, and I love it. Edit. I was typing in a car. Excuse the typos.
That's where the meaning of laconic comes from.
On the crowning of King Henry V, he backdated his own reign to before the date of the Battle of Bosworth, meaning anyone who was loyal to him now but had shown any sign of opposition at Bosworth was now a traitor and an enemy to the realm. Justice served.
Fuck. That sounds like the premise behind the Blackadder.
French surrender in W2. Hitler dictates that the French capitulation take place at Compiègne, a forest north of Paris. This is the same spot where 22 years earlier the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I. Hitler intends to disgrace the French and avenge the German defeat. To further deepen the humiliation, he orders that the signing ceremony take place in the same railroad car that hosted the earlier surrender. The armistice is signed on June 22. Under its terms, 2/3 of France is to be occupied by the Germans. The French army is to be disbanded. In addition, France must bear the cost of the German invasion.
By many counts, including French historian Max Gallo and former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, France's most shameful historical episode.
Khosrow Anushirawan was a Shah of Iran in the 500 CE. He took over a town, Antioch, that used to belong to the Byzantine Empire, ran by Emperor Justinian. But before he burned it to the ground, he had architects and a bunch of other people go through and record exactly what the city and its buildings looked like. He then built a new town that looked exactly the same and named it Where Antioch Khosrow, which translates roughly to a Dieter Khosrow's better version of Antioch. And that's not even all of the ways Khosrow trolled Justinian. I recommend watching extra credit series on this dude. It's nuts.
Okay, I know what BC and AD is. I know what B and C is. What's ACE?
Julius Caesar's death. At least he died, surrounded by friends.
The first recorded incident of a group project where most of the group doesn't do the effing work.
I love it because there are several levels. There were about 40 conspirators. Caesar received 23 stab wounds. So right off the bat, and not even accounting for people managing to stab him multiple times, about half the folks involved did jack crap. But then later his body was examined, and the doctor concluded that only one of those was probably fatal on its own. Even of the people that actually did any work at all, just one got it right and didn't half-ass things. That's a group project.
Not the biggest, but definitely one to note. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle ordered all U.S. troops out of France, as he said the country was leaving NATO. AJ's first words were to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. But when Dean Rusk mentioned whether or not the 60,000 U.S. soldiers buried in France were to be removed, de Gaulle simply stood up and left the room, embarrassed.
It really should be noted for context. This is after decades of animosity starting in Netherbotu, with us generals seeing de Gaulle as potentially the next dictator they'd have to fight. Highlights include threatening to join the Russian sphere if Vietnam were granted independence. Oh boy, that ended well.
Not the biggest, probably, but the first that came to mind. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response to the Nazi demand that Bastogne surrender.
When Germanic tribes invaded Britain after the Romans left, they named the native Celts Walisk, meaning the native Celts Waliske, meaning where they themselves were the foreigners. That later became the word I Welshi, which the English promptly adopted for phrases like Welch on a bet. Tell, Doctor, all of history has been one giant etymological middle finger to the Welsh.
When Otto von Bismarck was about 50, he was walking down a street when a man ran up to him and shot him 5 times. Otto then turned around and began to beat the absolute crap out of him until some armed guards come to help him. When they inspected Otto for wounds, they found that all 5 hit, but they all either just grazed him or bounced off his ribs. Literally the Iron Chancellor.
When Alcibiades fucked the Spartan king's wife, then fled to Persia, became a high command and made it back to Athens, where he once started as a politician and became one again. He said F you to Athens and became one again. He said F you to Athens. He betrayed them, Sparta and Persia, and got away with it because he looked so damn good.
Henry V3 divorcing Catherine of Aragon.
During the conquest of Constantinople, now Istanbul, when Sultan Mehmet had his ships carried on oily stakes by thousands of men to get past the big chain that prevents ships to enter Bosporus.
Several of them. My favorite is when Deng Xiaoping ordered the Chi-Com army to invade Vietnam in order to teach them a lesson about the South China Sea dispute. The Chinese rolled across the border and were like, where is everyone? Looks like they didn't even field an army when they started getting hit with guerrilla types of attacks. The Chinese commies were supposed to mop the floor. They ended up incurring way more casualties than they anticipated and basically retreated back to China after 1 month and declared victory. Couldn't get a solid body blow on the Vietnamese army.
Soviets invading Poland in 1939.
On 30, the September 1938, a treaty called Munich Agreement was signed, causing Germany's annexation of Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia where many German people lived. It was signed by leaders of UK, France, Italy, and Germany. UK and France signed it because Hitler promised that he won't go to war if he got the Sudetenland. We all know how that turned out. But that's not all. The biggest fuck you to Czechoslovakia was that they weren't invited to the meeting. Yes, they weren't invited to the meeting about their own region. Also, France was an ally of Czechoslovakia at the time. So yeah, thanks for support, France. Sorry for any mistakes. English is not my first language. Also, my first Reddit post.
In 1941, the US requested Panama grant a 999-year-long lease to build over 100 military bases within their country. The Panama government asked for compensation in return, which the US felt was too high. The US responded by overthrowing their government by orchestrating a coup. They then signed an agreement with the new one.
1898, Philippine independence. It was not a real independence. It's just the US buying Spain's property and fucks it up his own way.
I'm not an historian, but I know this one fact. In 1918, during the Battle of Villers, Bretonneau, Major James Robertson made a plan to steal a German tank stuck in no man's land. There was no point in getting it because it was dangerous going out there, and the tank wasn't a threat to anyone. Not giving F about that, he grouped with 12 other men to retrieve that tank, under machine gun fire and inside mustard gas, just to say to the German army, fuck you, look what we got here. Thanks to him and the other men, today that tank is the only original one tank we have, and it's called Mephisto.
The first cell phone. The first call ever made from a cell phone was to a competitor's landline, Big D Energy.
After the Restoration, the English dug up the body of Oliver Cromwell and hung, drawn and quartered the body, sticking the head on London Bridge.
Hitler committing suicide underground.
The burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Upon receiving his certificate as the first black PhD in Harvard history, W.E.U.B. Du Bois allegedly remarked that honor, I assure you, was all Harvard's.
Andrew Jackson was walking around Washington, D.C., when an assassin tried to kill him with 2 pistols. Both pistols misfired, and Jackson proceeded to beat the would-be killer within an inch of his life with his cane.